Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In this episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in Cuba. If you're a regular viewer of the channel, you'll know that we've been covering the situation in Cuba over the past few years, and unfortunately, it's been getting progressively worse. But over the course of the past few weeks, there has been a complete meltdown in Cuba because the national grid, which provides electricity to everybody, broke down, and there have been nationwide blackouts.
With traffic lights down, police directed traffic. Schools, theatres and businesses were shuttered. Petrol stations were closed. It's bad news for tourism, one of the motors of the island's economy.
Up until recently, the Cuban authorities had been shedding the load of the power grid. So basically, they had planned blackouts in various areas of the country for 6 or 7 or up to 12 hours at a time. And people were notified about this in advance. But the complete failure of the grid represents the first breakdown that we've seen, and this represents a very serious problem from Cuba's point of view, because firstly, they don't have all of the actual infrastructure to be able to repair the grid. They're claiming that the embargo that's in place by the USA is actually preventing them from buying in the essential equipment that they need to actually repair all of the power stations. But secondly, because of the way Cuba has developed over the last 60 years, its power network is dependent on oil. Now, obviously, that sounds absolutely crazy that a country would build its power network to be dependent on oil, because oil is the most expensive form of fuel that you can find. But following the introduction of the US embargo in February 1962, Cuba lost its single biggest trading partner, and it then buddied up to Russia because we were in the heart of the Cold War period. And because Russia had an abundance of oil, it said that it would provide Cuba with lots of free oil, and so Cuba built its power stations to be fed with oil. And for a period of time, that went very well. During the Cold War period, when Russia was providing all of that oil, Cuba was very happy. However, in the late 1980s, when Russia itself started to get into difficulty, the amount of oil coming from Russia started to slow down. And when the Soviet Union was broken up in 1991, Russia stopped supplying Cuba, and that left Cuba in a major situation. However, it managed to find alternative supplies from Venezuela, which is also a communist country and happens to be the country that has the largest oil reserves in the world. So again, for a period of time, it worked quite well from Cuba's point of view because they were receiving lots of free oil from Venezuela. However, once Venezuela was hit with sanctions itself by the USA in 2018, following allegations of rigging the election in the country, Cuba has been in dire straits. And unfortunately, it's not easy to be able to replace all of your power network because that's obviously hugely expensive. Cuba doesn't have any money whatsoever, and it doesn't have any friendly neighbours who are going to help it out. As I said at the start of today's video, I've been talking about Cuba for the past 3 years, and the problem with giving you detailed information on Cuba is that it's quite hard to come by. There isn't a lot of information in mainstream media, and so I'm having to search around on lots of different locations to pull together these stories. And the sponsor of today's video, Ground News, that I've been working with for more than 2 years, are extremely helpful when I'm pulling together this information. Because Ground News isn't an independent news reporter, it's an aggregator. It takes stories from all around the world and puts them into one place, which is absolutely fantastic from my point of view because it means I can do all of my research without having to spend days hunting around on the internet. And if we look at the articles that Ground News has pulled together talking about the blackouts in Cuba, you can see that they've aggregated 115 different articles. And one of the really useful things that Ground News offers is the political bias of those articles. So you can see that out of the articles that Ground News sourced, 25 of them leant to the left, 13 of them leant to the right, and 16 of them were in the centre. And the great news is that Ground News is offering Joe Blogs viewers a 50% discount on the Unlimited Vantage plan. And this is the best deal that Ground News have offered at any time in 2024, but it won't hang around for long, so I would recommend that you jump onto it. And if you've already got a Ground News subscription, then maybe you could offer one as a gift to somebody because we're coming into the holiday period. But don't forget to use my code, which is in the link below, or scan the QR code on the screen now.
The situation that we have been facing has worsened in recent days. Of all the factors that affect us, fuel shortages are the most significant.
Now, interestingly, the one country that is actually helping Cuba at the moment is Mexico. And it's been reported that 412,000 barrels of crude oil recently arrived from Mexico's state-run oil company Pemex. In 2023, Mexico supplied 16,000 barrels of oil per day to Cuba, and that's ramped up to 20,000 barrels per day in 2024, which on an annualised basis, at a cost of $80 per barrel, equates to around $1.6 billion worth of aid that Mexico is currently providing to its neighbour. So that obviously sounds quite promising. However, the problem that Cuba has is that it needs 120,000 barrels of oil every single day just to keep the lights on. Now, in 2023, Venezuela was providing 60,000 barrels, so around 50% of Cuba's needs. However, because of the economic problems in Venezuela, they've now dropped that amount to around 32,000 barrels. So on top of the 20,000 that Mexico is supplying, Cuba is only receiving around 50,000 barrels compared to its requirement of 120,000. And the big question here is, what's going on with Russia? Why are they not stepping in and helping out Cuba? They've had a long-standing relationship all through the 60s, 70s and 80s. These two countries were very close when Fidel Castro was running Cuba. What is Russia now doing to help Cuba out? Well, according to analysis undertaken by Jorge Pinon, Senior Research Fellow at the University of Texas at Austin's Energy Center, which tracks global shipments of oil, Russian oil is nowhere to be seen. So the fact that Cuba doesn't have enough oil to be able to keep all of its power stations running, and also the fact that these power stations are now more than 40 years old, and they were originally estimated to have a useful lifespan of around 25 to 30 years. Now, maybe if Cuba had been maintaining those power stations, you might be okay going past 40 years. However, they haven't been doing that. They've left them to go to rack and ruin, and the country is now in a really dire state because its power stations are well beyond their economic life, and they don't have enough fuel to be able to keep them running even if they were operating okay.
US maximum pressure sanctions on the island, implemented by Trump and left in place by Biden, are a major cause of this energy crisis. Oil tankers delivering fuel to the island can be sanctioned. In all, the US has hit Cuba with more than 200 sanctions over the last decade. Economists say they cost the economy billions of dollars a year. Washington insiders say the goal is still regime change.
One of the main contributing factors to Cuba's dire economic situation is the trade embargo in place with the USA. Now, this was put in place in 1962, following Fidel Castro taking over Cuba. And unfortunately, from Cuba's point of view, Donald Trump increased the severity of the embargo during his presidential campaign, and all of those sanctions were left in place by Joe Biden. Now, the United Nations meets once a year. It has its General Assembly. And at its recent meeting, it voted overwhelmingly in favour of the USA dropping the sanctions. Of the 193 United Nations members, only the United States and Israel voted against the motion to drop the sanctions, and Moldova abstained. I'm not quite sure why Moldova abstained. I know why Israel is teaming up with the USA, because they're obviously very close, and Israel wants the continued support of the USA with regards to everything that's going on in the Middle East at the moment. Not quite sure what was in it for Moldova, but they didn't bother to vote. And Cuba's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Bruno Rodriguez Parrilla, who attended that United Nations meeting, had a lot to say on the matter. He called the US trade embargo a flagrant, massive and systematic violation of the human rights of our people, and the most encompassing, comprehensive and longest-standing system of unilateral coercive measures ever applied against any country. He went on to say that the damage done to Cuba since the blockade was imposed 62 years ago amounts to $1,499 trillion, which for any mathematicians watching is actually 1.5 quadrillion US dollars. And he went on to say that during the last 18 years of the blockade, Cuba has lost $252 trillion, and that the accumulated costs of 4 months of economic blockade is equivalent to $1.6 billion, which would be enough to guarantee for an entire year the delivery to all Cuban families of a ration food basket. In response to this, it was reported that the US representative said the United States stands with the Cuban people. Approximately 1,000 unjustly detained political prisoners remain behind bars in Cuba, more than at any point in the country's recent history. Nearly 700 of those detentions are connected to the July 11, 2021 historic protests. These people have languished in horrible conditions in Cuban jails for exercising their freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly. The Cuban government has dragged its feet in responding to several requests inquiring into conditions of human rights, including freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and the freedom of peaceful assembly. Some of these requests have remained pending for more than 10 years. Sanctions are one element of the broader effort to advance democracy and promote respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms in Cuba. Taking stock of the myriad challenges facing the Cuban people, the United States sanctions include exemptions relating to exports of food, medicine, and other basic goods to the island country. So clearly there remains a distinct difference of opinion between why the USA has imposed the sanctions against Cuba and why Cuba believes the USA is doing this. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this update video because the news that we've now got complete nationwide blackouts in Cuba is obviously very serious, because if you're trying to run an economy, you need to have the power grid working. You need to have all of the companies within your country receiving electricity so that they can make things, produce things, sell it, and then be able to make some money. But one of the other big issues that Cuba is now facing as a result of these blackouts is the impact on tourism. Tourism has become a huge part of the Cuban economy. In fact, people go to Cuba because it's quite quaint. It hasn't really moved on a lot over the past 60 years, so you can see a lot of the old architecture, and famously there are lots of US cars from the 1950s that are still running. They're operating as taxis in many situations. So it does look fantastic when you look at it on a video. However, the reality of the situation for a lot of those tourists is now quite grim, because if you turn up and there isn't any electricity, then clearly you're going to struggle to be able to go to restaurants, to be able to actually go around the country doing things. Some of the hotels do have their own generators, so they can generate their own power. However, that's dependent on getting the fuel to be able to keep those generators running. And if the fuel isn't arriving, then at some point those hotels could run out of power as well. So at the moment, Cuba isn't really hugely attractive for many tourists to go to. And the less tourists that go mean the less dollars that are going to be spent in the country, and that's going to have an even further negative impact in terms of the economy. But what we've seen over the course of the past few weeks is because of these national blackouts, we're seeing schools closing, we're seeing gas stations closing. Basically, all the businesses within Cuba are having to shut down. And that's clearly going to make it even worse. The economic situation will not improve if none of the businesses can actually open. And the problem that Cuba has is quite fundamental. Firstly, the power network is very old. It's well beyond its economic life. Now, as I said earlier in the video, they may have been able to get away with that if they were maintaining it all the time. If they were constantly improving it and replacing all of the parts, then maybe you could get something that was originally estimated to run for only 25 years to run for 50 or 60. But Cuba haven't been doing that. They haven't been investing back into the infrastructure. It's becoming more old and decrepit on a daily basis. But the other big problem that Cuba has is that the power network predominantly runs on oil. Around 90% of all of the electricity is generated using oil, and that is the single most expensive way to generate electricity. It's also not very environmentally friendly, so it's a double whammy from Cuba's point of view. But the problem that they have now is that they don't have enough oil. Cuba doesn't produce enough of its own oil to feed its own network, and so it's relying upon friendly neighbours to be able to give it some because it doesn't have any cash to be able to buy it. Now, Venezuela was previously providing around half of all of the oil needed, but it's cut back severely on those supplies as a result of its own financial problems. Now, Mexico has stepped in and is providing some of the gap between what Venezuela was previously providing, but not enough. So the big question here is, where is Russia? Why have they not stepped in and started supplying 120,000 barrels of oil per day to Cuba to be able to keep everything running along quite nicely? Well, I think the bottom line answer to that is that Russia is suffering at the moment. It's got its own financial troubles. It's spending an absolute fortune on the war in Ukraine. It's also struggling in terms of being able to provide all of the fuel to countries like India and China because of the increase in the sanctions and the focus on all of the shipping that's going on right now. So I don't think Russia actually has enough spare capacity to be able to give it away to Cuba, and so Cuba is being left to its own devices. So the overall summary of today's video is that the situation in Cuba is now getting worse. The electricity grid has failed. We are now seeing regular nationwide blackouts. That will only make the economic problems worse because businesses won't be able to open for business, and it's likely that we may see a further increase in the exodus of people. We've seen over 1 million people leaving Cuba over the course of the last 18 months, and that exodus could ramp up over the next few months. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. Here's something to put a smile on your face.